Imagine, having to leave your home, like
Yeah.
the place your family's been for generations, with only what you can carry. That's what millions of people faced during the partition of India back in 1947.
Yeah, 1947.
And it might seem like ancient history, but it shaped the world we live in today in ways you might not realize.
Yeah.
So get ready to deep dive into this story. It's one of upheaval, resilience, and the enduring legacy of, one of the largest migrations in human history.
Partition wasn't just about drawing a line on a map. It was about communities and families and identities that had been connected for centuries just being ripped apart.
So before we get into the chaos of partition itself, let's set the stage a bit. We've got some sources that really paint a picture of life in British India under the Raj, right?
It's incredible how the British East India Company went from like this small trading operation to controlling this vast subcontinent.
Yeah, it's like they showed up for a business deal and ended up just running the whole place.
Yeah.
And they weren't exactly known for being like benevolent rulers. They were all about extracting resources from India, which, led to economic hardship and resentment among the Indian population.
And what's really interesting is that the British, maybe unintentionally, laid the groundwork for the divisions that led to partition by introducing a system of census-taking that really emphasized these religious categories.
So instead of just counting people, they were like categorizing them by their religion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this simple act had huge impact. It made religious identity political and set the stage for separate electorates based on religious lines.
It's like they were drawing these fault lines that would eventually, split the nation apart.
Yeah.
And then in the middle of all of this, you have these two really important figures emerge, Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Jawaharlal Nehru. It's fascinating how these men, both Western-educated lawyers who could fit in at any British club, ended up leading their people down such different paths.
Yeah, their relationship is super important to understanding partition. Jinnah actually advocated for Hindu-Muslim unity at first. He was even a member of the Indian National Congress.
Which was the party that was pushing for independence from the British.
Exactly.
So what changed? Why did he become the leader of the Muslim League and the driving force behind Pakistan?
Well, Jinnah became more and more disillusioned with the Congress Party. He felt like it was dominated by Hindu interests and that Muslims would be marginalized in a unified India if Congress was in charge.
And then you had Nehru leading the Congress. He was all about this secular socialist India, wasn't he?
Yeah, Nehru wanted a unified India where religion didn't matter in government. He believed in a socialist model with economic equality and social justice.
But his vision didn't appeal to everyone, especially those who felt like their religious identity was a key part of their political goals.
Right.
So you have these two brilliant leaders, both fighting for freedom, but with very different ideas about what that freedom would look like. And this difference and the mistrust that grew between them, it really set the stage for what was to come.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how personal relationships and ideologies and historical forces can all clash and shape the destiny of nations. And then you have World War I happening in the background, India's dragged into the conflict, and it really had a big impact on the whole push for independence.
Right, it kind of exposed the cracks in British rule. Indians were fighting for the empire, but back home they were second-class citizens.
Exactly. And the war created this sense of disillusionment, especially after that massacre at Jallianwala Bagh in 1919. British troops just fired on a crowd of unarmed Indians, killed hundreds.
Yeah, that was a major turning point, right? It shattered any illusions about the British Empire being this benevolent force.
Absolutely. It fueled the independence movement, and it galvanized Indians, Hindus, and Muslims together against British rule. But it also, unfortunately, added to that climate of fear and mistrust, which would only worsen in the years leading up to partition.
And around this time, the idea of a separate Muslim state, Pakistan, starts to gain some traction. It was seen as impractical at first. But as these tensions grew, it resonated with some Muslims who feared being marginalized in an independent India that would have a Hindu majority.
And that fear wasn't completely unfounded. You got to remember that the whole idea of India as one nation-state was pretty new. The subcontinent had been this mix of kingdoms and empires for centuries, different cultures and religions. Sometimes they got along, sometimes they didn't.
So a unified, secular India, it was appealing to some, but it was also a huge experiment, a leap of faith for certain communities.
Exactly. And for some Muslims, the idea of Pakistan, this land of the pure, offered a sense of security, of being able to control their own destiny. It meant living under their own laws, practicing their religion freely.
But even with the tensions rising, could partition have been avoided? Was it just inevitable?
Well, World War II definitely played a major role. It really weakened Britain economically and politically, and it really pushed for independence. After the war, it was clear the British Empire was ending. The question wasn't if India would be free, but how.
And then comes Lord Mountbatten. He's sent to India in 47 to oversee this transition to independence. But the situation he walks into is a complete powder keg.
Mountbatten was actually a close friend of Nehru, and with the violence increasing, he starts to think that partition is the only way to avoid an all-out civil war.
So instead of keeping India together, they decide to split it up.
It's a decision that historians still debate to this day. Some say partition was unavoidable given the distrust between Hindus and Muslims. Others believe it was riddled and poorly planned, that it created more problems than it solved.
And to make it even worse, the timeline for partition was incredibly rushed. They set a deadline of August 1947, just a few months after making the decision.
Yeah, that haste had terrible consequences. Not enough time for planning or figuring out what to do with the people who would be displaced. It was a recipe for disaster.
And on top of everything else, they bring in this British lawyer, Cyril Radcliffe, to actually draw the border between India and Pakistan.
Radcliffe knew nothing about India. He was given 5 weeks to divide a subcontinent, to decide which communities would belong to which nation.
5 weeks to redraw the map of a civilization thousands of years old. That's just crazy.
It was a hopeless task. The Radcliffe Line, as it's known, was drawn pretty much randomly, often cutting through villages, families, historic regions, with little thought to the people living there.
And that line, drawn so quickly and without understanding the complexities, it became the center of one of the biggest mass migrations ever. Millions of people were suddenly on the wrong side of the border, forced to flee their homes, leaving everything behind, even loved ones.
It's really hard to grasp the scale of the tragedy. The 1947 Partition Archive, which we've been using for this deep dive, has so many heartbreaking stories. Families torn apart, unbelievable violence, people risking it all just to reach safety, to get to what they considered the right side of this new border.
All because of a line on a map.
And that line still casts a long shadow. The conflict over Kashmir, for example, that's a direct result of the unresolved problems from partition. A Muslim-majority region claimed by both India and Pakistan, Kashmir has become a symbol of that enduring legacy of division and the tensions that still exist in the region.
It's tragic that this region, known for its beauty and culture, is now a battleground for 3 countries with nuclear weapons.
And it's not just about the political consequences. The trauma of partitions still affects generations of South Asians in the subcontinent and around the world. It's part of who they are, shaping their memories, their relationships, how they see the world.
You know, it's amazing to think how this one event, over 75 years ago, still has such a huge impact on people today.
It really shows how powerful memory is, especially when it's tied to something so traumatic. And those personal stories from the Partition Archive, they really bring it all to life. It's one thing to read about the facts and figures, but it's another to hear from the people who actually lived through it.
Yeah, I was especially moved by the story of your grandmother, having to run from her home when she was just a girl. And then to have that virtual reunion with the family living there now, that's a powerful example of how even with all the pain and loss, you can still have these connections that bridge the divides created by partition.
It really was remarkable. And you know what's interesting? They actually had different opinions on whether partition was the right thing.
Oh, really? What were their thoughts?
Well, my grandmother, she went through the horrors firsthand, and she believes it was necessary for the safety of Muslims in the region. She feels the violence would have been even worse if they'd stayed.
That's a perspective you don't hear very often. It's easy to judge partition looking back. But for those who felt their lives were in danger, it must have seemed like the only choice.
Exactly. But then Johnny Ver, the man whose family lives in her childhood home, he sees partition as this tragic split that keeps holding the region back. He thinks the subcontinent would be stronger and better off if it had stayed together.
It shows that there's no easy answer to whether partition was right or wrong. Everyone who lived through it has their own perspective, based on their own experiences, their beliefs, their politics.
It's like looking through a kaleidoscope. Every turn shows you a different side of this complex event. And we need to understand that complexity if we really want to grasp the lasting impact of partition.
And it's not just about understanding the past. It's about learning from it for the future. What can we learn from partition about the dangers of dividing people, the importance of talking to each other, the need for compassion?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that lines on maps have real consequences for real people. When you divide people based on religion, ethnicity, anything like that, you create the conditions for conflict and suffering.
It reminds us to be really careful how we define ourselves and others, because those definitions have a huge impact on how we treat each other and how we build our societies.
Absolutely. And I think empathy is so important too. Partition shows us that there's always more than one side to the story, and that even in conflict, there are people with hopes and dreams and fears, just like us.
It's a call to see the world through other people's eyes, to try and understand their experiences, especially if they're very different from our own.
And at the end of the day, I think partition makes us ask ourselves, how do we build bridges instead of walls? How do we create societies where everyone feels like they belong, where we celebrate diversity and respect our differences?
Those are questions we all need to think about, not just in South Asia, but around the world, wherever people are divided.
It's a big challenge, but it's worth it. And what we've seen from the stories we've discussed, even in the darkest times, people are incredibly resilient. They find ways to connect and hold on to hope.
That's a great note to leave our listeners on. So thank you for joining us on this journey through this pivotal moment in history. We hope you'll keep exploring and learning about partition, about its causes and its consequences, and its lasting legacy.
And remember, the things that divide us are often man-made, but the things that connect us, like shared stories and empathy, those have the power to create something new, where understanding and hope can overcome hatred and division.
That's a powerful message. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.